Have you ever wondered what happens at the very moment your heart stops beating? The moment your last breath leaves your lungs and all vital signs go quiet? Traditional science always told us that it's the end, that everything goes out like a candle blown out by the wind. But what if I told you that thousands of people around the world who were clinically dead and then came back describe a completely different story? Before we go any further, if you value content that challenges what you think you know about existence, hit that like button now and subscribe to the channel. The algorithm needs to know you want to see more content like this. What I'm about to share with you isn't based solely on beliefs or abstract theories. These are consistent accounts documented by renowned doctors and scientists over the last few decades. Patterns that repeat across completely different cultures, from staunch atheists to devout religious people, from children to the elderly. There are elements in this post-death journey that seem universal, transcending any cultural programming or prior expectations. Death, my friend, seems to be more of a transition than an end. Like water changing states, from ice to liquid, from liquid to vapor, while keeping its molecular essence intact, only experiencing a new form of existence. And the most fascinating part, consciousness not only survives, but expands in ways our physical brain could never process. The first phenomenon reported by almost every person who has had a near-death experience is both disturbing and revealing. Imagine feeling more alive than ever, more lucid and aware, while watching your own body lying motionless below you. This isn't some hazy hallucination or a confused dream. People describe medical procedures performed on their bodies with absolute precision, conversations between doctors in distant rooms, and objects that would be impossible to see from the position they were lying in. I was floating near the ceiling of the emergency room, watching the medical team trying to bring me back, recounts Maria, a teacher who suffered cardiac arrest during routine surgery. I could see the doctor sweating, the nurse whispering something to the assistant. There was a clock on the opposite wall showing 3:47, a detail that was later confirmed in the medical records. How could I know that while I was unconscious? This first stage of the post-death journey represents the initial break from physical identity. The feeling is not one of loss, but of liberation. As Thomas, a former skeptical executive, explains, for the first time, I realized I am not my body. I am the one who observes through it. It's like being stuck inside a heavy diving suit your whole life, and suddenly finding yourself swimming freely in the ocean. What makes this phenomenon particularly intriguing for researchers is that it occurs even in people who have never heard of near-death experiences, including very young children and individuals from isolated cultures. Furthermore, the details reported are often verifiable, information that it would have been impossible for the patient to obtain by conventional means while they were clinically dead. This first stage deeply challenges the materialistic view of consciousness as merely a product of brain activity. How can someone perceive, remember, and process information when all measurable brain functions have stopped? And if consciousness doesn't depend entirely on the brain to exist, what other capabilities might be latent in us? After the initial phase of depersonalization, the journey itself begins. Thousands of accounts converge on the same experience, the feeling of being pulled or drawn into a dark tunnel, yet not in a threatening way. It's like being transported through a dimensional corridor that connects two radically different states of existence. It was like being at the center of a whirlpool, but without fear, describes Joao, an engineer who suffered a serious car accident. There was darkness around me, but unlike normal darkness, it was as if it were made of velvet, welcoming and vibrant. And ahead, always ahead, there was a light that grew stronger every moment. This light, no words in our earthly vocabulary can do justice to what people describe. It isn't just a physical light, but an intelligent presence, radiant with unconditional love. Many describe it as more real than anything they had ever experienced, a glow that illuminates not only the external space, but seems to penetrate and reveal the true nature of everything. Sarah, a doctor who nearly drowned at the age of 34, recalls, "When I encountered that light, I instantly knew I was in the presence of the source of all existence. There was no judgment there, just a love so pure and complete that it made all earthly love seem like pale shadows in comparison. It was as if, for the first time, I was being truly seen and understood in my entirety. What is particularly remarkable is how this experience radically transforms the fear of death. People who return from this experience, even those who faced painful terminal illnesses, describe a deep peace regarding death. It isn't resignation or denial, but a direct understanding that what awaits us is a return home, not a fall into an abyss. Neuroscientist Dr. Peter Fenwick, who has studied thousands of these cases, observes the encounter with the light seems to fundamentally reprogram the way the brain processes the fear of death. It's as if these people received an emotional inoculation against the existential terror that plagues much of humanity. As the post-death journey progresses, one of the most disorienting yet liberating phenomena occurs: the complete dissolution of our linear perception of time. While during an out-of-body experience a person may still have some relation to earthly chronology, in the encounter with the light and the subsequent stages, time as we know it simply stops existing. Robert, a physicist who experienced cardiac arrest during a marathon, tries to explain it was as if the past, present, and future were simultaneously available. There was no before or after, only an eternal now that contained all possibilities. I could see moments from my childhood not as memories, but as realities as present as the current moment. It was like understanding that time is just a limiting lens through which we perceive reality when we are in our physical bodies. For our three-dimensional minds, it's nearly impossible to fathom this experience. Yet it aligns fascinatingly with the most advanced theories in modern physics. Ever since Einstein, we know that time isn't absolute but relatively fluid. Some contemporary theoretical physicists, like Julian Barber, propose that the linear sequence of time might be just a perceptual illusion, not a fundamental property of the universe. What near-death experiences seem to suggest is that once freed from the limitations of brain processing, our consciousness can access a broader perspective where events are not organized in sequence, but coexist in an eternal multidimensional present. During those minutes when I was clinically dead, recounts Sophia, a university professor, I experienced what seemed like centuries of living. I not only saw my life, but understood causal connections between events decades apart. When I returned to my body, the doctors told me I was dead for only 7 minutes, but for me, it was like having lived several complete lives. This time distortion is so common in near-death experiences that researchers consider it one of the most consistent markers of the phenomenon. As Dr. Raymond Moody, a pioneer in near-death studies, explains, in the post-death state, 1,000 years can feel like one day, and one day like 1,000 years. It's as if the person enters a realm where time, as a sequential measure, simply does not apply. And that brings us to a profound question. If our consciousness can exist in a state where time isn't linear, could it be that our entire existence, past, present, and future, already exists simultaneously on a more fundamental level of reality? One of the most transformative aspects reported in near-death experiences is the radical change in the way of communication. In our physical world, we are limited to exchanging information through spoken or written language, facial expressions, and body gestures, methods that are often insufficient to express the complexity of our thoughts and emotions. However, in the post-death state, that communicative barrier simply disappears. People report a form of direct, instantaneous, and complete communication, what many call telepathy, but that goes far beyond the simple transmission of thoughts. I didn't just hear the thoughts of the presences around me. I felt them, completely understood them, explains Alexander, an executive who survived a serious plane crash. It was like every thought carried not only its surface meaning, but all the emotions, contexts, and nuances associated with it. A single telepathic sentence contained the equivalent of hours of earthly conversation. This form of communication completely transcends linguistic barriers. People of different nationalities and languages report perfect mutual understanding during their encounters with other consciousnesses in the post-death state. It's as if, free from the limits of the physical brain, we tap into a universal language of consciousness. Dr. Pim van Lommel, the cardiologist who led one of the most extensive studies on near-death experiences, observes what many patients describe suggests that in the absence of a functioning physical brain, communication occurs in a much more efficient way. It's as if verbal language is a primitive technology we only use because our physical brains cannot process information more directly. Even more impressive is how this telepathic ability appears to work not only with other disembodied consciousnesses, but also with the very light, often described as the source of all wisdom. Individuals report receiving vast volumes of knowledge instantly, not in words or sequential images, but as entire blocks of understanding that simply appear in their consciousness. It was as if I could ask any question about the universe, about my life, about anything, and the answer was already there before I even finished forming the thought. Recounts Mariana, a medical student who had a near-death experience during surgery. It wasn't like receiving information. It was more like being reminded of something that, on some level, I already knew. This way of communicating makes us wonder. Could verbal language just be a limited substitute for a purer form of communication that our essence already understands? And what if we could bring some of that telepathic clarity into our everyday interactions? As the post-death journey deepens, many report encounters with beings whose nature completely defies our earthly understanding. We're not just talking about deceased, loved ones, or well-known religious figures, even though those encounters are also frequently mentioned. We're referring to presences from a completely different order of existence. They were like fields of pure consciousness, describes Thomas, a university physics professor who had a near-death experience after a heart attack. They had no human form, but I could perceive them as distinct individualities. Imagine oceans of intelligent light, each with its own unique vibrational signature. Communicating with them was like diving into their waters and instantly understanding perspectives that would take lifetimes to articulate in human language. These presences are often described as multidimensional, existing simultaneously on several levels of reality. Many report feeling as if they were in the presence of beings whose wisdom and compassion go beyond any human measure, as if they were individual expressions of a cosmic intelligence. Dr. Kenneth Ring, a psychologist and pioneer researcher into near-death experiences, noted in his studies that these encounters tend to be perceived by people in ways that are understandable within their own cultural context. But when we dig deeper, we find qualities and attributes that transcend any specific religious tradition. What makes these accounts particularly intriguing is how they align with descriptions of non-physical beings found in spiritual traditions around the world, from the devas in Hindu tradition to the angels in Abrahamic traditions, or even the spiritual guides described by indigenous shamans. It's as if, for millennia, humanity has been trying to articulate encounters with these presences through the religious symbolism available. Claire, a nurse who had a near-death experience during childbirth, shares, "The being I encountered was pure wisdom and love, but not human or even remotely anthropomorphic. It was like a living geometry of light that could assume any form necessary to communicate with me. While I was in its presence, I received knowledge about the interconnection of all life that completely revolutionized my understanding of reality." These encounters suggest a cosmos inhabited by forms of consciousness far more varied and advanced than our materialistic paradigm can conceive. If such presences exist, what implications would that have for our understanding of our place in the universe? One of the most surprising and seldom discussed aspects of near-death experiences is the recurring presence of complex geometric patterns that seem to contain and transmit information in their very arrangement. Many people report glimpsing, during their experience, geometric structures of such indescribable beauty and complexity that they seem to be the very foundations of reality. It was like seeing the universe's source code, describes Michael, an architect who experienced a near-death event after a motorcycle accident. Pulsing geometric shapes, interconnected, creating patterns within patterns, infinite fractals that somehow I knew were the matrices of every physical form. The most extraordinary part is that these shapes weren't just visual. They transmitted knowledge directly. It was as if geometry itself was a language. These descriptions have notable parallels with the so-called Platonic solids in sacred geometry, Tibetan mandalas, Hindu yantras, and even with patterns that are now being discovered by quantum physics as fundamental to the structure of reality. The pattern known as the flower of life, found in ancient temples around the world, is often mentioned by those who return from these experiences. Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who had a profound near-death experience during a coma induced by meningitis, wrote about visualizing ornate patterns unfolding like petals that seemed to contain within their very structure truths about the nature of consciousness and the universe that went beyond any verbal understanding. What makes these accounts particularly significant is that they often come from people with no prior knowledge of sacred geometry or theoretical physics. Very young children who go through near-death experiences frequently draw these same patterns after their return, having never been exposed to them before. Many modern scientists, including physicist Nassim Haramein, have been exploring how certain geometric structures are fundamental to the organization of space-time, from the subatomic scale to the structure of entire galaxies. What near-death experiences seem to suggest is that, when freed from the limitations of physical perception, our consciousness can directly grasp these fundamental patterns of creation. During those out-of-body moments, recounts Sandra, a literature professor with no scientific background, I understood that every physical form is just a dense expression of these primordial geometric patterns. Our bodies, the trees, the planets. Everything is a specific manifestation of a cosmic geometry that organizes energy into form. This realization raises a fascinating question. Could there be a universal language of creation, encoded in the very structure of geometry, that all consciousnesses recognize intuitively when freed from the constraints of physical perception? Among the most extraordinary phenomena reported by those who return from near-death experiences is access to a vast repository of knowledge, often described as a cosmic library, or, in more esoteric terms, the Akashic records. This phenomenon goes beyond mere individual memory or knowledge, suggesting the existence of a universal informational field that contains absolutely everything that has ever happened, is happening, or could possibly happen. It was like being in an infinite space where all information existed simultaneously, recalls Carlos, a history professor who had a near-death experience after a car accident. I could access any knowledge simply by directing my attention to it. There weren't physical books, but rather something like bubbles of living experience that contained events, knowledge, and emotions. When I approached one of these bubbles, I didn't just know the information, I experienced it completely. This phenomenon has striking parallels with concepts found in various spiritual traditions. The Akashic records of Hinduism and Theosophy, Carl Jung's collective unconscious, and even the emerging scientific concept of morphic fields proposed by Rupert Sheldrake. All these ideas suggest, in different ways, that there is a level of reality where information is stored in a non-local and timeless way. The most surprising part is that people often return from these experiences with specific knowledge they did not previously possess. There are documented cases of individuals who, after a near-death experience, demonstrate an understanding of advanced quantum physics concepts without any prior training, or who suddenly begin to speak languages they had never studied, a phenomenon known as xenoglossy. Janet, an accountant with no previous interest in physics, recounts, "After my experience, I started drawing complex diagrams showing the relationship between consciousness and matter. My family was shocked because I had never shown this kind of knowledge before. Months later, we found out that my drawings were astonishingly similar to some theoretical models developed in cutting-edge physics." Neurologist Dr. Penny Sartori, who has studied near-death experiences for years in hospital settings, observes, this aspect of near-death experiences is particularly challenging for the materialistic paradigm. How do you explain that people can return with precise information that completely transcends their previous knowledge and educational background? This experience suggests something deeply transformative about the nature of consciousness. Instead of being just a byproduct of the individual brain, it seems to be connected to a vast universal informational field. When the limitations of brain processing are temporarily removed during clinical death, this broader connection becomes accessible. If such a field really exists, the implications are revolutionary. It would mean that nothing is ever truly forgotten, that all knowledge and experience are permanently recorded on a fundamental level of reality, accessible under certain conditions of expanded consciousness. One of the most consistently reported elements in near-death experiences is the panoramic life review, a process often misunderstood as a divine judgment, but which survivors describe as something much deeper, more compassionate, and transformative than any traditional concept of the final judgment. It wasn't a cosmic court as we imagine on Earth, explains Elena, a lawyer who had a near-death experience at the age of 42. It was like being inside a multidimensional theater where I relived every moment of my existence, not just as I experienced them, but simultaneously through the emotions and perspectives of everyone involved. When I hurt someone, I felt exactly the pain I caused. When I helped someone, I felt the gratitude and relief I provided. What makes this experience particularly extraordinary is its holographic quality. It isn't just a sequential recollection, but a multidimensional immersion into every action, thought, and choice experienced from multiple perspectives at once. The linear flow of time dissolves, allowing an entire lifetime to be reviewed in seemingly infinite detail during what on Earth would only be a few minutes. Dr. Jeffrey Long, who has documented thousands of near-death cases, notes, the life review isn't about external judgment, but about deep self-understanding. Remarkably, even in the face of our worst mistakes and failures, people report feeling an unconditional love permeating the entire experience. There is no condemnation, only a compassionate understanding of the lessons involved. This process reveals a fundamental principle that transcends traditional religious notions. The true impact of our lives isn't measured by material successes or external achievements, but by the quality of human interactions and the love we share. Small acts of kindness often shine with impressive brilliance during this review, while great achievements driven by ego can seem hollow. The question that reverberated throughout the review wasn't, how much did you accomplish? Or, how successful were you? Shares Roberto, an entrepreneur who suffered a cardiac arrest during a surgery. The question was simple. How much did you love? How did you seize every opportunity to grow in compassion and understanding? Interestingly, many report that there is no external punishment in this process. The clear understanding of the impact of each action is both the revelation and the mechanism for transformation. This view echoes the concept of karma in Eastern traditions, not as punishment or reward, but as a natural process of cause and effect within consciousness. Some people also describe zones or states where consciousness remains temporarily stuck in self-punishment or dense emotional states, what some traditions call zones of suffering or purgatories. However, these are not portrayed as imposed punishments, but as self-perpetuated states that eventually evolve when the consciousness is ready to transcend them, often with the help of beings of light. This broader understanding of post-death judgment offers a deeply ethical, yet non-punitive, perspective on human existence. We are responsible for our choices and their consequences, but within a context of infinite compassion and endless opportunity for growth and redemption. One of the most fascinating and less discussed aspects of near-death experiences is the perception of organized structures and communities on the post-physical plane, often described as cities of light, spiritual colonies, or mansions of learning. Far from the stereotypical image of a cloudy, ethereal heaven, many report glimpsing complex societies and architecture of transcendent beauty. It was like a city made of living light, describes Fernando, an engineer who had a near-death experience after nearly drowning. The buildings seemed conscious, responding to the thoughts and needs of the inhabitants. There were structures that I recognized as learning centers, hospitals for newly arrived souls, and large gathering halls where groups met for planning and celebration. Everything radiated purpose and harmony. These descriptions have notable parallels with what mediums and clairvoyants have reported over the centuries. The famous American medium Edgar Cayce spoke of healing temples and schools of wisdom in the spiritual realm. In Spiritism, as codified by Allan Kardec, there are extensive descriptions of organized colonies where souls continue their development between incarnations. What makes these accounts particularly convincing is the consistency among people from different cultures and beliefs, including those with no previous knowledge of these concepts. A 5-year-old child who experienced a near-death experience during surgery drew precisely what they described as the city where everyone learns things before being born again, despite never having been exposed to any literature on the subject. In these communities, souls are described as having distinct roles and purposes. Some work as receptionists for the newly arrived, others as caregivers, teachers, or planners. Many report meeting mentors and guides who apparently accompany their progress through multiple lifetimes. Sophia, a university professor who had a near-death experience after complications during childbirth, recounts, "I was taken to something like a cosmic university. There were rooms where people studied the lessons of their past lives and planned for the future. I saw what I can only describe as life consultants, beings of great wisdom who helped others understand their challenges and potentials. The level of organization and purpose was extraordinary." What's even more intriguing is that many describe these communities as maintaining subtle contact and influence on the physical world. Groups of souls apparently work together to inspire, guide, and sometimes even protect those still incarnated, suggesting a continuous interaction between different planes of existence. David, a doctor who has had multiple near-death experiences, shares, "I saw how some of these communities maintained what looked like advanced posts near the terrestrial dimension, monitoring and lending a hand during global crises or times of transformation. It was like a vast spiritual support system working behind the scenes of human history." If such structures truly exist, they suggest that death is not a dissolution of identity or purpose, but transition into broader forms of service and learning within a highly organized and intentional spiritual economy. The final phase of the post-death journey explored in this video is, paradoxically, the return to physical life, a phenomenon that doctors often consider medically and statistically unlikely, if not impossible, in many of these cases. This return is rarely described as accidental or random, but as a conscious decision, often made with guidance from the beings of light or the greater presence encountered during the experience. "I was completely at peace, absorbed in that infinite light," recounts Rebecca, a nurse who was declared clinically dead for almost 9 minutes after an anaphylactic shock. Then, gently, I was shown images of my small children and the impact my absence would have on their lives. There was no pressure, just a clear presentation of the consequences and possibilities. The decision to come back was mine, made with the full awareness that the road back would be painful, but necessary. The moment of return is often described as traumatic, a brutal contrast between the expansion, clarity, and unconditional love experienced in the post-death state and the limitations, pain, and confusion of the damaged physical body. Many report an initial resistance, followed by a resolute commitment to the mission or purpose identified for their return. Dr. Sam Parnia, who conducts research on consciousness during clinical death, observes, "Many patients describe a feeling of uncomfortable constriction when they return to their bodies, as if they were putting on a heavy, restrictive suit after experiencing complete freedom. This is often accompanied by a period of mourning for the loss of that expanded state." The most extraordinary aspect is the profound transformation that accompanies the return. Longitudinal studies show consistent and lasting changes in the personality, values, and life perspective of those who have undergone significant near-death experiences. Before my experience, I was a typical materialistic businessman, obsessed with status and acquisitions, confesses Ricardo, an executive who suffered cardiac arrest during a meeting. 6 years later, I'm still in business, but with a completely different purpose. Human relationships, making a positive impact on the world, and spiritual growth are now my top priorities. The irony is that this change in values has brought me far more success and genuine satisfaction. These transformations include a significant reduction in the fear of death, greater compassion and empathy, a decrease in materialism, an increased ability to appreciate everyday experiences, and often the awakening of intuitive skills that had long been dormant. Family and friends often describe the person as radically changed, as if a new individual now inhabits the same body. Some return with what they call specific missions, ranging from simple messages to be delivered to complete career changes to devote themselves to humanitarian or educational causes. Others bring back knowledge or skills that were previously inaccessible, such as sudden artistic talents or revolutionary scientific insights. Dr. Edgar Cayce, a physician who has studied hundreds of these cases, observes, returning isn't the end of the experience, but the beginning of its integration into the individual's life. The following years often involve a complete reassessment and reconstruction of identity, relationships, and life purpose. We have reached the end of this extraordinary exploration of what happens when we cross the threshold of physical death. The 10 elements we explored, the depersonalization, the tunnel and the light, the transcendence of time, telepathic communication, encounters with non-human consciousness, sacred geometries, access to universal records, the compassionate life review, the organized spiritual communities, and the transformative return, form a coherent and consistent pattern reported by thousands of people around the world. What makes these experiences particularly significant isn't just their prevalence or cross-cultural consistency, but their profound transformative impact. People who go through near-death experiences rarely come back the same. Their values, perspectives, and behaviors change radically, almost always in the direction of greater compassion, spiritual purpose, and a reduction in materialism. Dr. Kenneth Ring, after decades of studying these phenomena, concludes, "We are witnessing what appears to be an evolution of human consciousness catalyzed by these experiences. The survivors of near-death experiences serve as pioneers returning from an unexplored frontier of consciousness, bringing vital information for all of humanity." But the most important question remains, what do these experiences mean for those of us who haven't gone through clinical death? First, they suggest that consciousness is much more than a mere byproduct of the physical brain. It appears to have transcendent qualities that continue and even expand when brain activity ceases. If this is true, it fundamentally transforms our understanding of who and what we are. Secondly, these experiences point to a universe that is fundamentally compassionate and meaningful, where nothing is ever really lost. Every action matters, and the essence of our journey is in growing in love and wisdom rather than in the accumulation of material achievements. Finally, they suggest that death, far from being the definitive end so feared by so many, might be a transition to a state of greater freedom, connection, and understanding. As beautifully expressed by Anna, a teacher who had a near-death experience at 63, death is just the moment when the butterfly finally realizes that the cocoon was never its true home. If you found value in this content, help us spread this transformative message. Like, share with those who need to hear this, and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the frontiers of consciousness and human existence. And if you have had a similar experience, consider sharing it in the comments below. Every testimony contributes to our collective understanding of this extraordinary phenomenon. The most important journey isn't the one we take through physical space, but the one we make through the layers of consciousness that reveal, step by step, our true, eternal nature. As ancient wisdom reminds us, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. Until the next video, remember, the light you glimpsed in this exploration is only a reflection of the light you already carry within you.